Okay. All right. I swear to God, this is the last class I ever live stream. Like, not the last class, but the last course, because setting it up every time always presents minor issues. Okay. I presume this comment has to do with the conversation we were having last time about Emmanuel and Brigitte Macron having a huge age gap. He was 19, she was 42 when directing his movies. Yeah, I still don't like it. I'm sorry. It's fine. I hope it works for them. I just don't like it. Okay. So we're talking, that's a lot of weird lines. That my connector dying? I broke it. And we transitioned into just the very intro, talking about, in terms of families and how it affects the lives of young people. Economist Melissa Kearney, right, who wrote this book, The Two-Parent Privilege. So really, really fascinating book. If you have the time and the inclination to go and read it, I think it's well worth the read. I know, if anything, the statistics, I didn't show them to you, but I was looking at them the other day on Gen Z and reading suggests none of you read anymore. But if you do, still read. If you're one of the few, this is a book that, you'd be well served to read. It's a very, very interesting argument. And I'm going to outline some of the bigger points, but obviously, if you read Kearney's book, she goes into a lot more depth than what I will here. Okay, so remember, if we go back to the beginning of this unit, Rigneris called marriage an issue of social justice, right? I'm defeated by this. I know it literally just requires me to go Alt-Tab and back into what I was doing, but I'm having one of those days where I'm defeated by simple problems. Okay, he calls it a social justice issue. All right, so what do we see in the kind of evidence that marriage is in fact potentially a question of social justice? Bliatsuka. I don't know. The problem is I don't know if it's my setup or whether it's the U of A's technology that's the problem. We're just gonna have to deal with the flickering screen. I'm sorry, I don't know whether sad. Makes sad noises. If it happens again, Bliatsuka. All right, we'll see if changing its sides fix things. I don't know. Now do I have audio on the live stream, or am I going to get a message like, there's no audio on the live stream? La la la. Okay, there's audio on the live stream. Okay. Deep breath. And try again. Okay. So, technical difficulties, friends. Alrighty, so I have no idea what I said 4 seconds ago, aside from a few curse words in Russian. Family structure, right? One of the arguments that Kearney makes is that family structure plays a big role in perpetuating inequality in American society. So, her book, right, wants to highlight a couple of major points. In the past 40 years, basically, there's been a big shift in the share of children living with married parents. And it happened largely outside the college-educated class, right? So it's mostly, you would think of like, she classes people by education class a lot. I've been talking through the course in terms of things like working class, blue collar, poor, middle class, upper middle class. She's classing it mostly by college completion or level of education. And so you see it most in, families where parents have, either not completed high school or only a high school education. Okay, in 2019, right, 63% of children in the US lived with married parents, down a pretty, big amount since 1980, right? You're talking, solid declines there. Okay. In 2019, 84% of children whose mothers had 4-year college degrees lived with married parents. That was 90% in 1980, right? So that is a much smaller drop amongst the college-educated class. And, by the same year, 60% of children whose mothers had only a high school diploma or some college lived with married parents, down 23% from 1980. So what do we see? What do we take from this? Decline in marriage is a class-based phenomenon, principally. I have it on, is it on my next slide? Yes. College-educated adults. There's a couple of things we can say about them. There has been declines in how many of them are married compared to the past, but as you see, it's relatively small, right? You're talking a 6% decline since 1980 up to 2019, right? So a few years ago now, but a much smaller decline than the 23% amongst the non-college educated. So what do we know about the college educated? Well, they're doing pretty well economically. Their earnings have risen, in that same time period. They're making more money, even adjusted for inflation, than they were in the past. So, those without a college degree, though, they are still getting married, right? And I think I made this point earlier when I was talking about Rigneris. They tend to get married to one another, right? So they meet, marriage tends to circulate kind of commonly within social classes, right? You tend to meet people and marry them that come from similar social backgrounds. This has gotten a little bit scrambled with online dating, but the pattern still mostly holds. You tend to marry people that are broadly similar to you in terms of things like values, socioeconomic class, and educational level. Okay, adults without a college degree, right? So high school, some college, or like 2-year certificates, high school or less than high school have seen, in the US, and this is true in Canada as well, their earnings have stagnated, right? So they have less purchasing power today than they had in the past. And they're getting married considerably less, right? We see the comparison in terms of how much marriage amongst the non-college educated has declined compared to the college education. They're getting married much, much less. Now, this is, broadly related to this phenomenon that we already talked about, right? The question of marriageability amongst the working class, right? And Rigneris kind of talks about that. A lot of working class women like the idea of getting married. They just don't think that the men that surround them are particularly worthwhile, so they don't marry them, right? They'll have children by them, they'll cohabit with them, but in terms of making that long-term kind of commitment, it's something that they don't tend to do. Okay, so our working class are also more likely to set up separate households, right? So dad and mom are likely to have separate households that they live in rather than living together. So it's not just that, the working class or non-college educated are simply living together. On the whole, they're just less likely to be together at all. Okay, now why does this matter? Well, obviously, there's a class advantage, and there's an advantage to having two parents, which we'll talk about as we go through this, but in really basic terms. So the children of college-educated parents, their parents are richer, so they benefit from having lots of resources, and the advantage of having two college-educated parents, and more often than not, two parents who are married, so who are co-present and able to balance responsibilities and kind of spread childcare across them, allowing them to do much more for their children. So I think we could confidently say that increasingly there's a college gap in family structure. And as I kind of said last time, we have marriage haves, and we have marriage have-nots. And these broadly sort of correspond with different socioeconomic strata and how well people are doing. Okay. Don't talk to me. We'll see. We'll see. I know. Sometimes I move slow through stuff. There's a lot here, so we'll get there. Don't talk to me about the future. Now is all that matters, right? We could all die in a thermonuclear exchange tomorrow. So why do you care about what happens in 3 lectures? Okay, so that's a grim thought for a Wednesday. So children of college educated, what's the kind of gap in these family structures? Okay, children of college educated mothers, right? We're going to focus on mothers a lot here because that's what Kearney does. A mere 11% live with an unpartnered mother, right? So a very, very small percentage. When you look at the comparison to non-college educated mothers, right, 29%, so almost a third, live with an unpartnered mother, and only slightly more, like 1% more, live with an unpartnered mother if the mother doesn't even have a high school degree, right? So high school degree, anything less than college doesn't make a huge difference in terms of their chances of living with only a mother, right? An unpartnered mother. Okay, and these gaps broadly exist. It exists across kind of white, black, and Hispanic families in different kinds of percentages. So there are race disparities among this. And if you want to, and I'll show you this on a subsequent slide, Asian families in the US have the highest rate of two-parent families regardless of education level. I'll tell you why this matters in a sec. Oh, okay. I don't have the race stuff here. I'm going to tell you now, actually. I thought it was on the next slide, but I have my slides mixed up in my head. Okay. This is going to matter a lot. One of the things that's kind of generally true in the US, it's increasingly true in Canada as well, is that the people with the highest earnings, so if you took by race, highest earnings, you have Asian, and you can split this, and there's not a huge difference. Like if you take East Asian and Southeast Asian, right? So if you could, these numbers kind of combine, like say China, South Korea, Japan, and then it combines it with like India, Pakistan, and other parts of Southeast, like Bangladesh, other parts of Southeast Asia. But if you take them kind of as a whole, right, the highest earnings of anybody in the United States is amongst those that are classified in US Census as Asian, right? So both East Asian and Southeast Asian, followed by white, then Hispanic, then black, and then I believe indigenous is below even black people in the United States. Okay, so we'll come back to that and I'll show you what these percentages look like, but lots of people have speculated that their particularly high earnings might be an ultimate reflection of that family structure that they have. Okay, so now why are there so many more unpartnered mother households today compared to the past, right? That big jump in terms of the number of one-parent households, what has driven it? So it is not, in fact, what you might think. And I think the tendency is to think that it's driven by divorce, but it's actually not driven by divorce at all. And it's not driven either by an increase in unmarried cohabiting couples. It is driven almost entirely by an increase in the share of mothers who are never married, right? So never married at all, and they're not living with a partner. Okay, so children living with married parents. So today, if you took a look at the total population, about 63% of children live with married parents, down from 77% in 1980, right? And I showed you earlier, there are big disparities in terms of college education level. So more than 21% of children in the US today live with an unpartnered mother. And other living arrangements, right? 8% only live with unmarried parents or a parent and an unmarried partner, right? So, this is a kind of conglomeration of parents who never married, right? So parents who have children and then live together but never marry, and typically mom who has a partner who is not the children's father but is living with that person. That's 8%. Single dads make up only about 4.8% of family structures, and a remaining 4.3 don't live with any parent at all, right? That doesn't mean they're by themselves. Typically that is with aunts and uncles or with grandparents, and grandparents are far more likely, right? Now these altogether do not make up a big percentage of the US population. The bulk of it, right, is made up by the 21% living with unpartnered mothers. Okay. And in terms of stable relationships and family stability, one of the things that we know, right, so of parents who are non-married and have a child, it's something like 80% of them say that they want to remain together, right, for the good of the child, but then only about a third of them are actually still together by the child's 5th birthday. So what children of unmarried parents experience more typically is pretty high levels of instability and family complexity, and a third of all fathers virtually non-present or invisible, not there at all in their children's lives, in those families whose parents aren't married, right? So, dad is completely out of the picture altogether. Must have a question slide here somewhere. What slides aren't in my... Are they not there? Oh, they're just mixed around. That's weird. I maybe uploaded the wrong slideshow. Curses. I should check them. Okay. I'm sure they're all there. Sorry about that. I took out a lot of things, so I shortened this section to make it a little bit more compact. Okay. And then I thought I broke my PowerPoint. I don't know what that is. Copilot? Okay, I'm sorry about that. I will double check on the next unit that everything is in the right order. Okay. All right. Family structure. Okay. If we look at the total US population, right? Roughly half of children are white, 13% are black, 6% are Asian, and 23% are Hispanic or Latino, whatever term you prefer. The US Census uses Hispanic. People sometimes use Latino or Latinx. I'm just going to go with what's on the census here. So, those who live with a married parent, what do we see? Well, it's 77% of white children live with married parents, 88% of Asian children, 62% of Hispanic children, and 38% of black children, right? And then if you look at, mother's education, Amongst white children, 88% of kids with a college-educated mom live with both parents, 69% of those with only high school, and 60% of those with high school. Okay, now you remember a second ago I told you who the highest earners are? Number one is Asian. And number one for, living with two parents, Asian children. Number two is white. And guess what? Number two, in terms of living with married parents, is also white. Number three, you probably get where this is going, is Hispanic. And that's also number three for the number of them who live with married parents. And coming in, at number four, is Black in terms of overall earnings. And, again, 38% of Black children live with married parents. So there's a really, really strong correlation between, two-parent family structures and upward mobility socioeconomically. And again, it's not for nothing that when we look at things like SAT scores, right? So that's your college entrance scores. That structure looks exactly the same, right? Asians number one, white number two, Hispanic number three, Black number four. When you look at, people applying for entrance into elite colleges with the GPAs that are required to get in there, it's Asians in the top position, followed by white people, followed by Hispanics, followed by Black people, right? All of this tracks in exactly the same pattern, to the point where elite universities like Harvard, a couple of years ago, they started basically weighting entrance on the basis of race. And particularly, they gave preference to Black and Hispanic students, and they denigrated especially the grades of, or deprecated the grades of Asian students, because if they didn't, they said, basically Asian students would get most of the spots at elite colleges, right? Because they score so well, right? Their academic scores are so good, their extracurriculars and all of that stuff are so high, their SATs, and I think ACT is the other one, are all that much higher than the other groups, that they would dominate college admission, and it would be like a bunch of Asian students at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MIT, Stanford, and then, some white students, and then a very small crop of Hispanic and Black students, all kind of tracing along these racial patterns. So a bunch of Asian students that got rejected from Harvard actually sued Harvard. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in the US ruled that yes, they were discriminating against Asians on the basis of their race, because they were giving preference to students from other backgrounds other than Asian. Okay, and especially to these two. And it was seen as being done for equal opportunity, but I think the argument from the Asian students was, well, we're also not white and we have the best score, so we should get into these colleges. And again, Asians are a very small slice of the US population, but dominate, all the tech sector, they dominate elite colleges and all sorts of things. Okay. Did I get everything on that slide? I did. All right. So, Black and unpartnered mothers. All right, so racial and ethnic differences. Again, what do we see? Amongst those who do live with, unpartnered mothers, again, we see this sort of, this inverted pattern from what we were just talking about. In terms of, having never been married, we see that 70% of Black unpartnered mothers are never married, right? Hispanics, it's 54, white, it's 38, and Asian unpartnered mothers, it's 32% who are never married. Now, again, that also matters because the other thing we see is that children whose parents were married and now have gotten divorced still have more resources, right? Their parents, their non-resident parent, typically the father, is more involved in their lives. provides more financial support to them, and all sorts of things like that, right? So they are more present both, physically and financially. So even there, even if your parents were married and then got divorced, it still gives you a better chance at life than having a never married mother, right? Or never married parents. Okay. So again, there's a gap based largely on education. Unpartnered mothers with a college degree are more likely to have been married, and that trend, again, is consistent across all racial and ethnic groups. So what does this do? Previously married parents, like I said, provide more resources, and fathers are more involved in previously married scenarios than in non-married scenarios, right? So it tends to be, a better scenario for children, right? And what's on my little graph here, this is from the book, we see, changes in, married, never married, and divorced, there we go, never married and divorced from different levels of education. And what you see, right, so divorced has actually gone down in all categories, right? So there's, go away, little thingy that keeps sticking up. So we see, right, 1980, we had more divorced parents. That has declined, in all groups, and the share of never married has increased, but the share of never married has increased a lot more for high school degree or some college and no high school degree compared, and the percentage of divorced, so they were married, has declined much more for those two categories. It's still above, half for those with four-year college degrees in terms of the households where people live with an unpartnered parent. But, for these other two categories, it's now below 50% whose parents were ever married. Little label. Why will you not die? Okay. All right. Let me clear that. What do I mean by the impact of mother's education where it says white children 80%? Okay. Where did I say that? Impact of mother's education. This part, I'm assuming, is what you mean. So amongst white parents. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. Right, so if we look at, if you live with married parents, right, it's 77% overall for white children. But if we break that down by education type, right, for the college educated, it's 88%. For, high school only, it's 69. And then for less than high school, no high school diploma, it's 60, right? So how educated a mother is will impact the type of family that children live in, right? And the more education mom has, the more likely her kids are to live in a household with two parents, right? Two married parents. So it goes down, the likelihood goes down as you move down that education ladder. That's what I meant. Okay. So that's the same chart. Okay, so child support and compliance, right? Now, the idea behind child support is typically that if you have a non-resident parent, right, either divorced or never married, child support should, fill in the gap in resources, right? Because, an unmarried mom raising kids by herself will have less resources than someone living in a two-income family. And child support was set up with the idea that it would kind of balance this out and force, non-resident fathers in particular to provide those material benefits that children would be lacking because they're not living in a two-parent household. So, what Kearney notes is that, well, this is kind of the idea. Basically, share of unmarried mothers receiving child support is far from 100%. You know, only about 44% receive the full amount that they are promised, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. 70% will receive some of their owed payment, right? So that would include the 44. So some or all. But there's about 30% who don't receive any of, you know, the child support payments that they should get. Okay, and only about half of custodial parents had a legal or informal child support agreement, right? So not even every single parent has a formal or informal agreement. It's only about half. Okay, so these are fun numbers. According, again, to the Census Bureau, somewhere around 33.7, and again, this is 2015 numbers, so it's a decade old, 33 billion in child support is owed to custodial parents. About 60% of that amount was received, and the average amount that a custodial parent, you know, receives annually is somewhere around $3,500, right? Now, if you're thinking my rent for 2 months would roughly cover $3,500, or 3 months, right? You're kind of getting the point, right? Child support agreements tend to be pretty low amounts. Not even you know, even people who have formal or informal agreements don't always get the full amount needed, and it's a really small amount of money, right? It's not a lot of cash. Like, I mean, imagine trying to put, none of you have children, I don't think, but I can tell you, like, let me tell you what my daughter's annual horse riding lessons are. They cost about $2,000, right, a year. My son's taekwondo is something like about $1,900 a year. And then like just swimming lessons for my youngest, which is the only thing he does, is somewhere around $600 a year. So you can already see that, you know, I mean, my wife and I aren't divorced, but if it was her doing it by herself and I was only, you know, throwing out about $3,400, you can see that that amount would get sucked up by extracurriculars alone, or the kids wouldn't do extracurriculars, right? Because it would exceed the amount of child support that I would be paying if that was the case. Okay, man, horse riding lessons are expensive. Now she wants to own a horse. I can't afford a horse. They eat a lot, apparently, and they're big and they get sick. You think of horses as big and strong, but apparently like grass can kill them, and that's what they eat. Stupid horses. Like, I should eat, like seriously, we were out at a ranch in BC and she was doing some riding, and this horse is like pampered. It eats like second cut alfalfa and it's eating like thistle off the ground, and the owner's like, "You stupid horse." I'm like, yeah, horses are dumb. Okay, anyway, the travails of my daughter wanting a horse is neither here nor there. Okay, so single parent households, about 23% of US children live with one parent. And in this way, the US is a bit of an outlier, thankfully, right? It largely seems to be owing to some of its real disparities in terms of kind of race and racial groups. So yeah, 23% of US children live with one parent. The global average is 7%. Owing to other societies that have much more stable and traditional family structures. Canada, you know, we're not American. We're a fair bit behind. In Canada, it's only about 15% of children that live in single-parent family or single-parent households. Mexico, right, 7%, much more traditional. Okay, so that is a good thing. Education and family structure. So more education tends to correlate with two-parent households globally. And in the EU, we see kind of similar patterns, right, to the US and Canada as well. 79% of children with highly educated mothers live in the European Union, live in married parent homes. Okay, now the EU is very big and diverse, right? It has roughly the same, a slightly larger population than the United States, but it's much more diverse in terms of its populations, ethnicities, and traditions. But, right, similar kind of pattern. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to live in two-parent households. The EU is a little bit different in that, in a lot of societies in the EU, people are more likely to cohabit. Unmarried parents are more likely to cohabit successfully than in the United States, right? So we see more cohabitation of unmarried parents, and it's more stable, right? Especially in France. In France, it's quite good. However, they are kind of, the US always leads the way, sadly. Expect a Donald Trump in Canada, I guess, at some point. I hope not. So the US, right, basically saw rates of single motherhood increase from the 1980s to 2011, 2015. And similar but less marked patterns, we've seen in other places, the UK, Norway, Spain, and France. I drew arrows under each of them in case you couldn't follow that I was talking about those 4 countries. Now, I don't know. I just like drawing arrows. My other class today was making fun of me for my many arrows. They're just fun to draw and easy, and I'm very bad at drawing other things. So, you should see me try to make a circle with this pen. It's all lumpy and weird. Okay. So we see kind of similar rates, although all of those places lag behind the US. And at kind of current rates will be well into the 2050s before they reach kind of where the United States is today. Okay, so by the way, this is one of those things where I had AI make this image, and you can clearly tell because there's lots of things that are wrong with it. It's just like, I don't know, this whole head thing is weird. It's like 2 merged heads. I don't know what's going on, but we do what we can. So what's good about two-parent families? Well, according to Kearney, one of the things is you have better patterns kind of established and better sorts of modeling of relationships, right? So in two-parent families, you're more likely to see parental love and cooperation, parents loving each other and working through challenges, which sets examples for future relationships. And again, this ends up becoming sort of a class system because, more married parents in your college-educated class who make more, right? So they're more likely to be middle class or upper class. So the children of middle and upper class kids see more successful relationships that they then mirror in the future, right? So what does that end up doing? They can expect to have more successful relationships as well. So that sets up their expectations for what love looks like and shapes their relationships into adulthood. So you're going to have, again, a sort of have and have not in terms of good patterns of relationships to model. Although don't model this picture. This picture is weird, and I don't like it, and I should replace it, but, time constraints. Okay. So, single parenthood and poverty. So, obviously, the big thing that two-parent families have that single parents don't have is resources. Monetary, and here I'm going to try to draw a clock. This is a clock. As well as time. Actually, that's not a bad clock. It's pretty good. Money and time, right? So, they have a significant resource advantage. Money and time. And this bubbles down to a whole bunch of really good things for kids. The money, it's always better to have more money than less money. More resources to, so that they have better nutrition. They have more extracurriculars. They can be more supported, right? They can explore their interests, even if it's something dumb, like an animal that eats grass and can be killed by grass, right? I don't understand horses. Or whatever it happens to be. So they have this, ability, and two parents, right? So more time to spend with children doing things like reading, homework, other activities, driving them to activities, and other forms of involvement. To the point where, at the very extreme end, and sort of the wackadoodle-ish side of the equation. There's been some scholars, I think it was out of the UK, that suggested that you reading bedtime stories to your kids was giving them an unfair advantage over kids whose parents didn't have time to read them bedtime stories, right? Because they were learning better like reading your kids bedtime stories, they learn vocabulary more quickly, they learn to read faster and earlier in life, and all sorts of things like that. There's been all sorts of cool studies on this. You can read about it in Kearney's book, where they basically encouraged parents from lower socioeconomic strata to read a little bit more with their kids, and the results in terms of early reading are dramatic. It's really cool. Again, take a look at the book. But to the point where this particularly, I'm going to say, kooky scholar was like, you shouldn't be allowed to read books to your kids because it's giving them an unfair advantage over other kids. And I was like, oh well, tough. If I don't read my kid a bedtime story, he ain't going to bed. So he'll bother me until midnight. So he's getting a bedtime story. Okay. Our single mother families. I know these slides are very white and boring. 5 times more likely to live in poverty than married couple families, compared to single father families that are only twice as likely to live in poverty than married couple families, right? So either way, either single mother families, which again are the majority of single parent families, right? 21% versus what, 4.8? 5 times as likely as their married counterparts to live in poverty. Now, the other thing is that poverty tends to last a lot longer. Married couples, even if they do end up in poverty, tend to recover and move out of poverty much more quickly. Okay, so 22% of families headed by a woman without a spouse live in poverty. 11.5% of families headed by a man without a spouse live in poverty, compared to only 4%, right, of married couple families that live in poverty, right? So in terms of economic arrangements, marriage appears to be a much better economic situation for obvious reasons, right? 2 incomes are better than 1. 2 parents have more resources than 1 parent. So, 5 times more likely equals 22-ish%. Okay. Poor adults are more likely, though, to become single parents, right? So if you are poor, you're more likely to be never married as well. Again, this is probably down to women not finding a male partner that they find suitable. I cannot believe I only have 4 minutes. Oh my God. Too many questions. How do they... Oh, I mean, child support in the US especially, in Canada too, is not monitored particularly well. It's monitored at the state level, so it varies tremendously state by state. With some states like Massachusetts doing really well, and other states like Florida apparently not doing particularly well. So child support is not monitored particularly well. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. AI is funny, right? Okay, I answered this question. 3 minutes. Okay, we're so close to being done this section. Well, not that close. Okay, I can do it on at least another slide in 3 minutes. So, child outcomes. So, not surprisingly, children of married mothers, right, with 2 parents have better outcomes. And the gap will persist even with same age and education levels of mothers, right? So it would be, so if you say if you take a married woman and an unmarried woman, both without a high school degree, it would be the life outcomes for their kids are going to be better for the one who's married. Same thing if they only have a high school degree or if they have a college degree, right? It tracks up. Now, orders of magnitude better the more education your parents have, but still that gap persists, in terms of age and education level of moms. It's always, more beneficial for kids in terms of life outcomes to have married parents. So, disadvantages of single mother households, We see consistent trends of disadvantage compared to two-parent households. Again, it's less time with parents, less money, more likely, especially amongst boys, to be crime involved, to be street involved, to be gang involved, to use substances, drop out of school, get suspended. All of these things are much more likely in those who live in single mother households. Now again, or maybe for the first time, that isn't to say that single moms aren't trying to do a good job, that they're, I don't want to be moralistic about this. It's not a moralistic argument. It is just a straight up data argument that, those extra resources, I'll put it as money and time, that's a much less good clock, seem to make a huge difference in the lives of children. Okay, and support from non-resident fathers, relatives, and programs never seem to be enough to totally make up those gaps. The more there is, right, so the more present a non-resident father is in children's lives, the better those outcomes are going to be, but it never entirely, and same thing with grandparents, aunts, and uncles who fill in those gaps, but it never quite fills in the gap completely. All right, and it's, a straight income argument. Higher income married parent households explains some of those gaps. Mostly policymakers have tried to help and have seen some success by increasing income for single mother families, right, through grants and programs, but even that never entirely makes up the gap. So even with income support, the differences in, and I'm going to underline experiences and put a little box around it and some sparkles, difference in income or differences in experience and outcomes remain, right? So it's just a different experience to not have married parents. I'm now officially out of time. I want to stay for another 10 minutes. No, I'm kidding. I can't do that. And I'll finish these slides. I could do it in 10 minutes, but we'll finish it in the 10 minutes on Friday, and then we'll jump to our next topic. Oy. I'll fix the slides at some point. Alrighty.